Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining me on this session. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. My name is Spencer Allingham, and I'm one of the senior solutions engineers at Condusiv, covering the EMEA region and East Coast of America. I really appreciate you giving me some of your time today. I wanted to talk about what our V-locity software can do to improve the performance of your SQL servers. Now, as we're going through, if you think of any questions, please do feel free to put them in the questions box in that GoToWebinar window, and I'll do my very best to answer them all in a Q&A session at the end. Remember, there's no such thing as a stupid question, so you're all very welcome to submit questions as they come to you. So with that said, let's get going, let's get into it. Now, Condusiv Technologies, who are we? We're a 38-year-old software company, which is quite a long time for a software company. And we produce software for Windows servers, workstations, and laptops that allow them, quite simply, to process more work in the same amount of time without the need for additional hardware. We've been a Microsoft Gold partner since about 1994 when they bought out Windows NT. We're a VMware Technology Alliance partner, and our software has been certified as Citrix Ready, especially useful for those who also use VDI in their environment. But for those with a particular interest in SQL Server, Microsoft have certified our V-locity software for use with SQL. And this is basically Microsoft certifying that V-locity doesn't adversely affect the I/O subsystem that a solution has to provide for SQL as defined by Microsoft themselves. Now, what was particularly interesting to me as an engineer was that during the testing that the Microsoft engineers did with SQL in Azure, we showed that when V-locity was providing assistance, there was about a 30% improvement in the number of SQL transactions that could be processed in the same amount of time. And I reckon they probably could have got more than that as well if they'd allowed a little more RAM for our caching engine. But I'll get into that in a bit more depth shortly. Now, each year for the last 5 or 6 years, we've surveyed IT professionals to get their opinions on various IT-related matters. And each year, the same thing rises to the top. There are often performance issues with applications that use SQL on the back end. In fact, most of our new customers find us because of that. And once they have V-locity running on their SQL servers, they often will expand that to cover their entire enterprise. In fact, 28% said it's so bad they actually get complaints from users. So that's 1 out of 4. And if you're on this call, you might well be in that group as well. And I'm afraid you're in very good company. Here are some results of some lab tests that were run, actually with Iometer, which is a storage I/O load generator that was configured to create a good mixed bag of different types of storage I/O traffic. And you can see that the number of IOs per second, or IOPS, that were processed increased from just under 3,000 to about 5,500 with V-locity. That was a 90% improvement in storage I/O workload. And in terms of how much actual extra storage workload that could be processed, that increased by 60%. So 169 gig processed without V-locity jumped up to 273 gig with its help. Clearly, more work processed in the same amount of time. And that's not bad for a software utility that you can install without any SQL code changes being required or any reboots. That's right, you just simply install the software without any disruption whatsoever to live running SQL workloads, and just as importantly, the users. Now, for those running SQL in a virtualized environment, as many are doing these days, it's important to note that as great as virtualization has been for server efficiency, one of the biggest downsides is that it adds complexity to the data path. So this is what your storage I/O streams will look like. And let me explain why this is bad for performance. There are 2 severe storage I/O inefficiencies causing this. First is caused by the behavior of the Windows file system. It will tend to break up writes into separate storage IOs and send each storage IO packet down to the storage layer separately. And this causes storage IO characteristics that are much smaller, more fractured, and more random than they need to be. And really, that's the perfect trifecta for bad storage performance. It's like a death by 1,000 cuts scenario that can be like pouring molasses on your systems. You've got everything running, but it's not running nearly as fast as it could be. Now, of course, you could just simply throw more hardware at the problem, but that's usually both expensive and disruptive. Unless you actually need more storage space, it's much better usually to tune what you already own to start getting the performance that you have already paid for. Now, on many of today's SAN storage solutions, IOPS headroom isn't really a factor anymore, which is a great improvement, especially with things like all-flash arrays. You tend to have way more IOPS capacity than you actually need. However, think about the storage IO that you are actually processing. As an analogy, think of a crowded room with 20-foot ceilings. All of the space above your head doesn't really help because you're not actually using it. It can still be difficult to move through that crowded room from one side to another. But if you empty half of the people out of the room and sequentialize the rest into lines, it's much easier and more efficient to walk from one side of the room to the other. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Focus on the space you are using, the IOPS you are using. We make that go 30 to 40% faster. Now, the second IO inefficiency is on the next slide here, and this is what Gartner called the IO blender effect. And it's also known as storage IO contention. Now, if you care about performance, it's certainly something that you want to think about when you have multiple systems like this, all sharing the same shared storage resource. Let me give you an example of how velocity was best used to solve this inefficiency. We have a customer that when they were testing velocity in an environment with 6 host hypervisors, I think they were ESXi servers, and they had a total of 120 virtual machines, not all running SQL, I have to say, but certainly there was a good amount in there. They started by deploying velocity to just one virtual machine. Unfortunately, they still missed their service level agreement or SLA and really didn't get the result that they were hoping for. The reason? They still had too many machines generating small, fractured, split IO traffic that was causing this IO contention, leading to the degraded storage performance. But the good news is, now that they realized how easy it is to deploy velocity and that no reboots were required, they then deployed to 10 of their busiest systems. And the result was that they made their SLA for the first time in a year by 3 minutes. As a test, they then removed velocity from all of the VMs, and then they missed their SLA by 5 minutes. So finally, they deployed the velocity software to 119 out of the 120 VMs. I think that one of the machines was running Linux, and we only work with Windows. But anyway, the result was that they made their SLA with 17 minutes to spare. And we verified in their change control process that velocity was the only change that had been made. And so the next slide now shows what it looks like. And this is really what a healthy IO stream should look like in order to get optimum performance from your hardware infrastructure. As you can see on the slide, there's a nice healthy relationship between IO and data. You're getting nice, large, unbroken writes and subsequent reads with every storage IO operation. There are now fewer storage IOs having to move between server and storage, but each one carries a larger payload of data. For example, you wouldn't send dump trucks off with one shovel full of dirt in the back. It's much more efficient to make sure they're filled up first. Velocity gets your data to where it needs to be more efficiently. Larger storage IO traffic also typically provides faster data transfer rates that allows you to process simply more gigabytes per second. If you look at any benchmarking tests comparing random versus sequential reads and writes on pretty much any storage hardware, including all flash, larger sequential storage IOs will always form smaller random ones. So let's take a look at how Velocity does this. So where do we sit first of all? Well, we're the orange bar that you see here in that Windows operating system. Velocity is a 100% software solution for Windows. It uses a couple of very lightweight filter drivers to add an extra layer of intelligence to help Windows process storage IO traffic in a more intelligent manner. And that benefits everything that sits below that Windows operating system in the stack. However, it's still the standard Windows write driver, creating a standard NTFS storage IO packet and sending it down the stack to the storage layer. We're not bypassing Windows in any way. We're just allowing it to make better choices in order to operate more efficiently with the storage. And this makes it very compatible. As we're sitting in that guest Windows operating system right at the top, we're sitting above everything else in your environment: hypervisor, physical host server, network, and storage. So if all of that is compatible with Windows, it is compatible with Velocity. We don't need a special flavor of Velocity for Nutanix and another version to work with Nimble and so on. They're all compatible with Windows and therefore compatible with us. Now, really, the most important part of this slide is that title, top of the stack. We treat the breakdown of storage IO and other inefficiencies at the source, not trying to address symptoms after the fact at some point further down that storage stack. And we typically alleviate 30 to 50% of all IO from having to go down to storage and that poor storage controller having to be drip fed small, fractured, randomized IO. Instead, we treat it to the larger, fewer, and sequential IO that it works best with, giving 30 to 40% faster data transfer rates. Now, our software does two things really to solve the problem, and I'll describe them both very quickly, and then I'll show you what typical results look like. First is write optimization. And I'll describe this engine on the next slide and how it eliminates 30% of all write IO. This is the engine that converts that small fractured random IO to the larger, fewer sequential IO. The second thing Velocity does is establish a tier 0 caching strategy by using some of the idle available RAM that you already have to serve up hot reads. And we'll get deeper into that as well. And I'll show you some screenshots of the reporting shortly. You'll see it's very transparent. But first, let's get under the hood a bit on how Velocity actually does this. So the first major engine that I mentioned is called IntelliWrite. This first technology handles write IO inefficiencies that put a tax on storage performance that's caused by the Windows file system. Windows will often try to write to a free space that actually is too small, causing the write to then be split. When this happens, the Windows write driver has to go back to the Windows free space cache to find another free space to continue writing into. But that also might not be big enough, and so the process is repeated and repeated and repeated until the write has finished. The more that happens during a write operation, the more delayed that write becomes. Each IO that has to be generated takes a measurable amount of time and resource to process, and as mentioned earlier, transferring data in smaller IO packets often leads directly to slower data transfer rates. It's terribly inefficient. In the real world, it could mean that a gigabyte of storage IO traffic that should be transferred in maybe 2,000 IOs is now being transferred in 30,000 or 40,000 IOs, maybe even more. IntelliWrite adds that extra layer of intelligence to the Windows write driver so that it can make better choices about how and where to write data, helping it to avoid the small, fractured, random storage IO traffic for increased efficiency. This in turn also presents the data in larger chunks at a time at the storage controller, which gives it the opportunity to create larger, more sequential stripes across its media using fewer storage level operations. Now, I've heard it said that IntelliWrite is like the storage performance intelligence that Windows never got. But as great as that engine is, check out this next one. So this is called IntelliMemory. This RAM caching technology is designed to provide read I/O performance gains. It's only satisfying read I/O requests from otherwise idle or unused memory, and any writes still go straight out to the storage. So there's no issue if a power outage occurs or anything like that. And I mentioned before that this is a tier 0 caching strategy right inside the Windows operating system. Even if you have SSDs or an all-flash array, RAM is still roughly 10 to 15 times faster. Plus, this cache eliminates the network overhead to get down to the storage layer and back, and provides a memory-to-memory transfer for a much faster, shorter I/O path. And IntelliMemory, in my mind, is actually quite unique among caching technology, and it's why many of the OEM PC manufacturers have actually licensed that to make their products work faster. So what actually makes it unique? Well, firstly, it dynamically sizes the cache so that it can't compete with anything else running on the machine. So you don't have to allocate an amount of RAM to cache with. It's automatically worked out for you in the background, and when more RAM is required for other things, it'll simply shrink the cache size and RAM back to Windows so as not to compete. It'll even shrink its cache to a 0 size if need be, and still leave at least 1.5 gigabytes free to ensure that it's never the cause of a memory starvation situation. So it's very safe to use. Secondly, and actually as an engineer, I think this is really cool, it uses an automatic machine learning technique to decide what needs to be in the cache and when. So the software gathers telemetry about how you're using each machine so that it can answer questions like, what are the main applications in use on the machine? What type of files are being accessed? What type of storage I/O streams are being generated? And at what times of the day, the week, the month, the quarter? So it can be really intelligent about what the hot blocks of data are that need to be in the RAM cache, and just as important, when. And this machine learning technique has proven to be really effective at reducing the type of read I/O traffic that tends to slow the storage down the most, to provide as much performance as possible to the applications you're running, like SQL, that you really care about. So a question that often comes up is, how much free RAM should you leave for caching with? Now, as a general rule, on a busy VIP server, if you can leave 16 gig of RAM free, that's usually enough to really make the performance of that machine fly. But if you can't afford 16 gig, leave 8 gig free. And if you can't afford 8 gig, leave 4 gig free. Even that is enough to make a difference. But if you start going much smaller than that, then the cache size would really become a little limited, and so would the improvements that you would get. So I hope that gives you an idea of how to right size the RAM, something which, as engineers, we're all very happy to help you out with as well if you want to get in touch with us. So here's one of the reports that you can see in the product. It can be viewed in the user interface on an individual machine, or it can be viewed through the central management console that ships free with the software. It will transparently show you things like how many storage I/Os were eliminated from having to take that trip out to storage and back, and what are the percentage of reads and writes that were eliminated. And it'll show you how much storage time is being saved by the storage not having to process all of that I/O traffic that V-locity was able to eliminate. You know, that's valuable storage processing time that's freed up to allow the storage to process more work in the same amount of time. Now, here's another report. Actually, this one's from the the velocity management console. That's your, and if you've got a wide deployment, that's a central point of command and control that you can just install on a VM. Makes it very easy to administer a lot of velocity instances. Most servers, you can see on here, have enough memory to cache with. That's this green system status icon. But you can see, for those that don't, rather than hunting for a needle in a haystack, you can easily see them here in the console. There's one here and there's one here. Very easy to cherry pick the servers that you might want to adjust and add a little bit more free RAM to. But what does this all mean in the real world? Now, we've got, of course, a lot of published case studies. Here are the highlights from just 9 of them. And I won't bore you by going through all of the details here, but it's definitely worth picking out a couple. Christus Health on the top left-hand side is a very interesting one. Their case study is one of the resources you can download from our site at condusiv.com. They were 18 months into the life of their SAN storage, but performance got so bad in the electronic health records, they had to raise a purchase order for a $2 million storage hardware upgrade. Ouch. And that pretty much just sat on the CIO's desk. But they were still searching for answers, and they thankfully tried the Velocity software and completely recovered their performance. And they were able to actually cancel the PO. Now, I realize hardware still needs to be bought, it still needs to be purchased, but you know what? Not 18 months into the life cycle of something. You expect storage hardware to last a little bit longer than that before having to replace or upgrade it. Another good example is Bell Mobility on the bottom left. That's a great SQL case study. Velocity reduced the storage I/O to their SAN by 61%. And that gave them SQL report queries that were simply 3 times faster. No additional hardware required. All they had to do was just install the software, which, as I mentioned before, doesn't even require a reboot and doesn't require any SQL code changes. So here's just a brief summary of some of the benefits you should expect with the Velocity software. So we've got better application performance, including SQL, and the applications that interface with it, improved storage latency and data throughput, reduced timeouts and crashes, shorter backup times, faster data transfer rates, and an extended hardware lifecycle. And that's not us just sort of pulling these as platitudes out of thin air. This is based on actual feedback that we've had from real world customers. Proof of concept process. You'll get a free copy of Velocity, which is yours to keep, and you can test it on any one of your servers. That's our gift to you. But if you really want to put Velocity through its paces, we'll provide you with a free proof of concept assisted by one of our engineers, and just to make sure that everything's set up for best results, and we'll help you by providing a written business case at the end, should you want to go on and request it for purchase. An evaluation is very easy and very fast. I know I mentioned several times that no reboots required. You just simply push it out to the target machines and check the results a week later. It really is as simple as that in most cases. Now, also another fantastic place to start is with this free Condusiv I/O assessment tool. This is completely separate from the Velocity software itself. But it's a very good way of answering the question, are your servers good candidates for the Velocity software and the type of benefits it can provide? With this tool, you can find out quickly and easily without investing a lot of time and effort. With the I/O assessment tool, nothing actually gets installed on the target servers, so it's completely non-disruptive. It just uses remote WMI calls to collect existing perfmon data from those target servers. And it'll measure 11 perfmon metrics and present this in an easy to read report. Or of course, you're very, very welcome to hop on a call with one of our engineers and get a deeper level analysis. Entirely up to you. Now, bit best practices for running this with SQL. I thought that might be useful, given that I know a lot of you guys have a particular interest in SQL. If you're not already capping the amount of RAM that SQL can take for itself, which I know many people are already doing, but I still come across those who aren't, it would be worth considering this to ensure that enough RAM is left free for Velocity to cache with for best results. Remember, it's been intentionally designed not to compete for RAM with anything else, and that includes SQL Server, which I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but frankly, if left to its own devices, can be particularly memory hungry. It's quick and easy to use the SQL Server Management Studios to set the values of min and max server memory. And I would recommend doing that if you want to see the best results from Velocity's Tier 0 caching strategy, certainly on your most important SQL servers at least. So, next steps. Personally, I'd recommend using that IO assessment tool. See if your servers are good candidates for the technology in Velocity. If it looks like they are, run a proof of concept to prove the point and see exactly what improvements Velocity can make with your real-world workloads running in your particular IT environment. Everyone's workload and environment is different, and there's nothing like, frankly, taking it for a test drive to really see for yourself what it would mean to your particular workloads. Of course, you can have free assistance from one of our engineers with no obligation to purchase. We want your particular pain points and success criteria to be addressed and met. Your success is our success, so we want to do what we can to help. Let us help you ensure that everything is set up to provide the very best results. So I hope this information has been useful. I don't think I can see that we've had any questions come through, but I'll go through some of the ones that usually come up. And if you think of any questions, feel free to put them in that questions box, and I'll do my best to address them. So the first. Oh, sorry, I tell a lie. It looks like we have had some questions through. Let me see if I can undock that. Here we go. So Justin says, how does the pricing structure work? That's a great question. And sorry, forgive me, being I'm just a lowly engineer. I'm not a sales guy. You could probably tell that. I'm just an engineer. I'm not sales or marketing, so I didn't include that in the deck. But there are several different ways of licensing the software. The most common one, the most popular one, is to buy what we call a host-based license. Now, you're not installing the software onto the host. You still install the software into the virtual machines or machines running in the cloud or what have you. But that host-based license, if it's like a VMware ESXi server or a Hyper-V host, it allows you to install the software onto all of the Windows VMs that are in that host. And if you create new VMs, well, then you can go ahead and install into those as well. You're already licensed. The second way of doing it is licensing it on what we call a per server basis. So that would be one license to one VM. Now, if you've got a hypervisor where you're only running 2 or 3 VMs, then the server-based license is usually the cheapest way to use the software and license it. I think the break point is if you're running 7 or more virtual machines in a host, then it becomes more economic to get that host-based license. We have quantity discounts available. So if you want to get a quotation for your particular environment, the best thing to do is really reach out to one of the account reps, and they can provide you with that quotation, or work with whoever your preferred software supplier is and get a quotation sent through them. So Justin, I hope that answers that. Sean says, where does this fit in with Docker? That's a great question. I know Docker's becoming more and more popular these days. Now, forgive me, I'm not a Docker expert, but I believe I can answer this adequately. So if you're running a containerized solution and you've got a Windows operating system underpinning that, then you can simply install the V-locity software directly into the operating system, and it will benefit from avoiding the split IOs, but most importantly, the RAM caching for any container that's running on that server. Of course, that isn't going to work if the underlying server OS is Linux. This is just software for Windows. So I hope that answers that adequately, Sean. Let me know if I didn't, and I'll try and readdress it for you. So what other questions? Does it just work on SQL servers? Well, actually, no. And you might have gathered as we were going through, my best practices recommendation is to try and get this software onto as many Windows machines as possible, sharing that same shared storage on the back end. That way, you're reducing and optimizing the most of the storage IO traffic, and now the storage and the network that's connecting it back to the servers is now simply doing the least amount of work. And the work it is receiving is already pre-optimized into these larger chunks of data that can be dealt with more sequentially and therefore more efficiently, giving you that greater data throughput and faster transfer rates. So can this help backups? Actually, yes, in a lot of cases it can. We've had a lot of customers give us feedback to say things like, oh, you shaved 25% off of our backup times, or our backups were bleeding over into the next working day and now they've gone back into the overnight backup window, so the users are happy again. It doesn't do it in every single case. It really depends on what the bottleneck for the backup is. But if the bottleneck is storage performance, then yes, it often will help with that and reduce backup times. Now, what about desktop or VDI environments? Can it help there? Yes, it can. And I mentioned at on one of the first slides that we are now Citrix ready. So you absolutely can use the software in desktop or virtual desktop environments. Just a quick note about VDI particularly. Often you tend to have VDI machines that fit into one of two categories. They're either going to be persistent, which is basically just a virtual desktop that people just keep logging onto, or non-persistent, where they get destroyed when people log off, and when they open up a new session, then a clone is made from a gold image. They do their work, and then when they log off, it gets destroyed again. The easiest way in a non-persistent environment is simply add the V-locity software to the gold image that those clones are made from, and then it's there, sitting in the background, starting to work as soon as the user starts using that VDI machine. For desktops and workstations, you can absolutely use this technology as well. The RAM caching can be very helpful if the machine has I would say 8 GB of RAM or above. If it's only got 4 GB of RAM, that's going to be a little bit restrictive for the RAM caching to work properly. But if you've got 8 GB or above on that laptop or workstation, very helpful. And there's actually a particular technology, which I didn't mention in this deck, but it's specifically designed for direct attached SSDs, which a lot of people have got in workstations and laptops now. And what this does is it prevents the write performance from degrading over time, because that's one of the dirty secrets about SSDs. Whilst the read performance always stays super fast, the write performance often will degrade over time the more you use that SSD. And the reason for that is really because of the way that NAND flash cells work. They don't work in the same way as old-fashioned spinning disks, where you can just plop some data next to some other data that's already on the platter. If you've got a NAND flash cell that's completely free of data, yes, you can just drop that data in, and that's why you get very fast writes on day one. But if you have a NAND flash cell that's, let's say it's 40 kilobytes in size, and it's already got 20 kilobytes of data in it, you can't then just add another 20 kilobytes of data next to it in that same cell. It doesn't work like that. What has to happen is the existing data gets buffered out, that cell then gets erased, then the new data gets put together with the old data, and both then get written back into that freshly erased cell. The more times you have to go through that erase write cycle during a write operation, the more that write gets delayed. And it tends to happen more the more you use that drive. So this hyperfast technology that we have in the software actually prevents an awful lot of those unnecessary erase write cycles from having to happen, which prevents the write performance from degrading over time. And of course, a happy byproduct of fewer erase write cycles means that SSD should wear out less fast as well. So, sorry, I got a bit off topic, but that might be useful if some of you are thinking about putting it onto VDI machines, workstations, and laptops and the like as well. So that probably covers another question as well, which is, will this work on physical systems? Yes, if they're running Windows, absolutely. It doesn't have to be virtual machines or Windows running in Azure or AWS. If you've got physical Windows servers, workstations and laptops, as I mentioned, it will absolutely work and provide you good benefit. Now, I think, is it difficult to handle hundreds of deployments of the product? Actually, no, it's very simple. And I've proven this again just recently. We have a management console called the Velocity Management Console, or VMC, we call it internally. Basically, you install that on a very lightweight VM, and that's your central point of command and control. From there, you can manage licensing, gather reporting data, and install the software across the network to target machines. And I did one recently in a hospital environment, and I think it was about 150 VMs that we deployed to in under 5 minutes, with no reboots required, no disruption, everything stayed up. It was very quick and easy, and the guy was quite impressed by that. And yeah, it's pretty cool. So it's not difficult to handle hundreds of deployments, even thousands. And what it's smart also about the way it does the deployments. It's not going to try and deploy to hundreds of machines at a time and swamp your network with traffic. It'll do, I think, 4 or 5 at a time. And then when one completes, it'll do the next one in the list. So it's trying to keep that network traffic at a minimum, but still getting that software deployed as quickly as possible. But 150 deployments in 5 minutes tells you how quick it is and easy. So Sergey says, if we're already using NVMe all-flash RAID 10, what will the real feel boost be like? Good question. And Sergey, if I'm honest, I would have to say I don't know, because it will depend very much on the workload and how close you are to reaching the IOPS and workload capacity of that environment. What I can tell you is I have done some testing on my workstation here, where I've got an NVMe connected SSD. It's a Samsung one. And I ran a test using Iometer for an hour to generate a workload without Velocity helping out, and then run it again for an hour with Velocity. And let me see if I can show you the results, because you should all still be seeing my screen here. Let me see if I can bring that up and show you what happened so you can compare the two. Here we go. So yeah, I put them in here. So this is the results without Velocity, and this is the results with Velocity. Okay, so without on the left, with Velocity on the right. So this was the first hour, and of course Velocity was turned off, so there were no IOs eliminated from going out to the storage. There was no storage time saved. In the second hour, when Velocity was turned on and I generated the same workload, it eliminated just under 18 million storage IOs from having to go out across the bus to the NVMe connected SSD drive. And it saved about 42 minutes accumulatively of storage time. Now, the most important thing is how much work could this machine process by itself? So that was about 215 gigabytes worth of storage traffic it could do by itself. With the assistance of the V-locity software, that went up to 482 gigabytes, so more than doubled. And the reason for that was the RAM caching in the software was able to reduce the latency, which was already very fast, from 0.085 down to 0.031. Now, whether that's enough that users are going to notice it, I don't know. The only thing I can suggest, Sergey, is try it for yourself and see, because everybody's environment and everybody's workloads are different. If it isn't going to provide a discernible improvement to the users, you've lost a few minutes of time to do the testing. And if it is, you're now the hero because you just made everything faster. So I know that sounds like a bit of a fudged answer, but it's the truthful one. I don't know, because everybody's environment and workload is different. That's my honest answer as an engineer. So I hope that's okay, Sergey. Sergey says, impressive. Thank you. You're most welcome. All right. I don't think we have any other questions, so I'll wrap up here unless any others pop up. Please do feel free to reach out to us. We've got a lot of engineers who are very willing to help with the software installs, run POCs, make sure everything's set up for best results. We'll step through those results with you. We can help you create a written business case if you want to put it forward for purchasing. We're here to help you as much or as little as you need. Just let us know and we're happy to engage. And if you want to get pricing and licensing options that are tailored to your specific needs, reach out to one of the account reps. As I say, they will help you make sure you get the best price. They can either provide it direct, or preferred, we can go through your chosen reseller or software provider. We'll work with pretty much anybody, anywhere in the world. So thank you everybody for spending your time with me today. I do hope this is useful. I'm sorry if we've gone a little bit over time. Let us know if we can be of any help. Thanks everyone. Take care. Have a very good rest of the day.